Hi everyone, this is Julia. I'm Rivers class of 2015, and today I'll be explaining commas. So this video was made for Miss Reagan Loomis, but obviously any of you are welcome to watch it, and I hope it's helpful. I'm making this video in Notability, and I actually included a podcast about Notability already on my YouTube channel. So if you have any questions about Notability or you want to make videos like this of your own, please feel free to just watch that video, and that should help you get started. So commas are extremely important, especially when you're writing instead of speaking, so I'm going to start with a few examples of where commas can go wrong and how to avoid those mistakes. So here's the first mistake. Here's the first example. So the first way to write the sentence is, let's eat grandma, and the second sentence is, let's eat, grandma. So in the first one, you're talking about actually eating grandma, which we would obviously not want to do. In the second one, we're asking grandma if we can eat, or telling her, let's go eat. So in this example, commas save lives. Slightly less drastic example is this one with murders, which I guess isn't that much better. The first sentence says, Anna claimed Frank planned the murder. And we could almost say, Anna claimed... We could almost say, Anna claimed that Frank planned the murder. And then in the second one, Anna claimed Frank planned the murder. So it changes the blame of who planned the murder, and obviously that would be very important if you're investigating a case or anything like that. And then the third example is Andrew quit saying he was looking for another job, or Andrew quit saying he was looking for another job. So again, you can put in a that here. Andrew quit saying that he was looking for another job. So in the first option, he's staying with his job, and the second option, he's leaving it. So again, it completely changes the point of the sentence and what Andrew's trying to say. So now let's look at these 5 Peskiest comma rules. These rules are from Miss Reagan Loomis. And I'll try to walk through all of them and give some examples and explain them as I go. So the first rule is that when you have 2 independent clauses in your sentence, you have separated them with a coordinating conjunction, you need a comma first. So a coordinating conjunction, that's sort of the first thing that stuck out to me. And if you don't remember what the coordinating conjunctions are, a really good way to remember them is fanboys. And the fanboys are for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. So if you ever see one of those conjunctions between 2 independent clauses, then you know you need a comma. And again, an independent clause, in case you've forgotten, is when you have a clause that could stand on its own like its own sentence. So, I walked into the rain. That could be its own sentence, so that's an independent clause. And I could not open my umbrella is an independent clause. And then but is a coordinating conjunction. So because we have all those 3 things, we can add a comma between the 2 right before but. So I walked into the rain, comma, but I could not open my umbrella. And there's a sort of a funny thing to keep an eye out for. If instead you have one subject with 2 verbs, you don't need a comma. So in this first example, I was repeated twice. So I was the subject for walked, and I was the subject for open. In the second example, I walked into the rain but could not open my umbrella. I is the subject for both walked and open, and it's the same I, so we don't have a comma here. Even though there's a coordinating conjunction, it doesn't count as 2 independent clauses, so we don't put in a comma. Our second rule is that a dependent clause before an independent clause needs a comma. So a dependent clause is a clause that can't stand on its own as a sentence. So, for example, before I went outside. So that's a dependent clause because it wouldn't stand on its own as a sentence. I went outside would, but we're looking at the before as well. So in this case, I buttoned my raincoat is an independent clause, and before I went outside is a dependent clause, so we need a comma between the 2. However, there should not be a comma between an independent clause and a subsequent dependent clause. So in the second example, I just switched the order. So in this case, we have the independent clause and then the dependent clause. And because the independent clause is first, we don't put a comma between the 2. So our third rule is that an introductory phrase, or a group of words that acts as a single word, usually one or more prepositional phrases, needs to be set off by a comma. So there are 3 types of introductory phrases that we'll be looking at. The first is a prep phrase, which is most common. The second is a participial phrase, and the third is an infinitive phrase. So, just a quick review. A participle is a verbal adjective, for example, swimming. You won't need to know that for your comma rules, but it's often helpful for identifying introductory phrases. And then an infinitive is a type of verb, so like to get, to love, to eat, things that are infinitive like that. So if you have a phrase like that, then you would put a comma. So I'll start back up at the top of this. So, by the end of the movie, my family was ready to go home. So my family was ready to go home as an independent clause. And because by the end of the movie is 2 prep phrases, we need to put a comma between movie and my. So by the end of the movie, comma, my family was ready to go home. In the second example, this is the participial phrase, swimming along. After swimming along, we need a comma because it's an introductory phrase followed by an independent clause. And then in the third example, we have the infinitive, to get to Toledo. So because we have the infinitive, we need to put this part, we need to put a comma after it. So it would be to get to Toledo, comma, take I-90 west. Our fourth rule is that if an aside could just as easily go in parentheses, or it's not necessary for identification, we can put commas around it. So I have two examples here. I'll just separate these. So in this first one, we're talking about a girl named Lily. And because we're given a name, Lily, not just a girl, we already know who it is. So in this first sentence, Lily, the girl he had always adored, barely even knew his name. We don't need to know this middle part, the girl he had always adored, to know who we're talking about, so we can put commas around it. It's not necessary for identification. And you can see this sentence, if you take out the part in commas, it looks pretty much the same. Lily barely even knew his name. And we still know who we're talking about. We're still talking about Lily. In the second example, however, you definitely need this middle section. So the girl who was wearing a red dress turned around. If you took out who was wearing a red dress, it would just be the girl turned around. And we can assume there's more than one girl that the speaker might be referring to. So you definitely do need this part, and you would not want to put commas around it. And then our fifth and final rule is that most quotations get set off with commas, but not when the quotation fits grammatically in the surrounding sentence. So this refers back to slides, which is something I did a lot in 9th grade at Rivers, and I know different teachers do it at different times. But slides are basically just when you talk about how to incorporate quotes into sentences. So you can use a comma, you can use that and use it as part of the sentence, which would be incorporating it grammatically. You could also use a colon at the end of a sentence, an independent clause. So there are a lot of different ways to incorporate your quotes, and it's nice to have some variety in your writing. So in this first example here, the writer uses a comma and says, Wharton tells us, comma, for years that quiet company had mocked his restlessness. And because it wouldn't, if you hypothetically took out the quotation marks here, if you took these out, it wouldn't really make sense. Wharton tells us for years. It changes the meaning of the sentence, so you definitely need the comma there. Whereas in the second option right here, Wharton tells us that for years that quiet company had mocked his restlessness. In this one, that slides into the quote, so we don't actually need a comma because the quote fits grammatically in the surrounding sentence. So I got a lot of my examples and the 5 comma rules from Ms. Regan Loomis, so thank you very much for her help, and I hope that was helpful.